68 years on this earth, and I thought I'd seen everything, until that Tuesday morning when death came knocking at my door, wearing a tiny mask and carrying something that would break my heart wide open. I was nursing my second cup of coffee on the porch, watching the Tennessee mountains wake up, when she appeared. A mother raccoon, standing bold as brass just 10 feet away, chittering sounds I'd never heard before, sounds that cut straight through me like a rusty blade. When it rains, it pours, and boy was I about to get soaked. Her fur was matted, her sides heaving, but it was her eyes that stopped my breath cold. Dark, wet, almost human, and streaming with what looked like real tears. In her mouth hung a tiny bundle, limp as yesterday's laundry. That little one's chest barely moved, barely. The radio crackled behind me. Severe storm warning, 72 hours. Time was running out. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. My hands started shaking before my brain caught up to what I was seeing. This raccoon, this mother, wasn't running from me like every wild animal should. She was asking for help, actually asking with those eyes that held more pain than any creature ought to carry. I set my coffee down with a clink that made her ears twitch, but she didn't bolt. Instead, she took a careful step closer, laid that little bundle down on my porch boards, gentle as you please, then backed away and sat. Just sat there, staring at me with an expression I recognized from 30 years of military medicine. Desperate hope mixed with the terrible knowledge that this might be the end of everything that mattered. The baby raccoon wasn't much bigger than my fist, ribs showing through patchy fur, one tiny paw curled against its chest. A nasty gash ran along its right hind leg, crusted with dried blood and dirt. But it was breathing, shallow, uneven breaths that whispered against the morning air. Behind me, the weather radio crackled to life again. Tornado watch extended through Friday evening. Residents advised to secure livestock and outdoor equipment. 72 hours. That's all the time anyone had before this storm hit, and something told me this little family had already been through hell getting here. I looked back at the mother, and I swear on Sarah's grave, that raccoon nodded at me. Nodded like she understood every word of the weather report, like she knew exactly what she was asking and why it had to be now. My arthritis complained as I knelt down beside the little one, but my hand steadied the moment I touched that soft fur. Warm, but not warm enough. The leg was definitely broken, maybe worse, and those labored breaths meant internal injuries I couldn't see. "What happened to you, little fella?" I whispered, and one tiny blue eye cracked open. Blue, bright, clear blue, just like... I stopped that thought cold. Wouldn't do any good going down that road again. The mother made another sound, softer this time, almost like a purr mixed with a whimper. She trusted me. Lord knows why, but she'd brought her dying baby to my door and trusted me to fix what was broken. Inside, Sarah's voice echoed from 5 years past. "You've got healing hands, Benjamin Walker. Don't you ever forget that." Maybe it was time to find out if that was still true. I scooped up the little one as gentle as I could manage, feeling the mother's eyes follow every movement. "All right then," I told her. "Let's see what we can do." The storm was coming, but right now all that mattered was the tiny heartbeat against my palm and the mother who'd trusted a stranger with everything she had left. The little raccoon fit in my hands like he belonged there, and that scared me more than I cared to admit. As I carried him inside, my mind kept drifting back to another pair of small hands, another set of bright blue eyes that used to light up whenever he saw me coming. Tommy had been 6 the last time he visited, all energy and questions and that gap-toothed grin that could melt the hardest heart. "Grandpa Ben," he'd said, pressing his nose against my kitchen window, Look at that raccoon family. They're washing their food just like Mommy taught me to wash my hands." I'd laugh then, ruffling his sandy hair. "Smart little critters, aren't they, buddy? Your grandmother always said they were almost as clever as you." Now, 5 years later, I was cradling another small life in these same hands, and the irony cut deep. Life has a way of bringing things full circle when you least expect it. I cleared off my kitchen table, the same one where Sarah used to bandage scraped knees and tend to every stray animal the neighborhood kids brought our way. My old Army medic kit was still in the hall closet, gathering dust but serviceable. As I laid the raccoon kit on a folded towel, the mother's chittering from the porch window reminded me I had an audience. The little one's breathing was steadier now, away from the morning chill. But that leg was definitely broken. Clean break, from what I could tell, probably from a fall or maybe a larger animal. His right eye was swollen shut, and there were scratches along his tiny ribs that spoke of a fight he'd been too small to win. "Easy there, little soldier," I murmured, cleaning the wounds with the same gentle care I'd once used on Tommy's endless collection of scrapes and bruises. "We're going to get you fixed up." The memory hit me like a sucker punch. Tommy's last afternoon with us, chasing fireflies in the backyard while Sarah and I watched from the porch swing. Marshall had called around 8, asking if we could keep Tommy overnight. Something about a work emergency. We'd been happy to have him longer. The next morning, driving him home, I'd been distracted, my phone buzzing with text after text about some crisis at the VA hospital where I'd been consulting. Important messages, I'd thought. Life and death stuff that couldn't wait. I never saw the deer until it was too late. The Chevy had rolled 3 times before coming to rest against an old oak tree. I'd walked away with bruises and guilt that would last a lifetime. Tommy hadn't walked away at all. "Grandpa Ben?" The memory of his voice was so clear I almost looked up, expecting to see him standing there. But it was just me and an injured raccoon kit, and the weight of all my failures pressing down like a mountain. Sarah had tried to tell me it wasn't my fault. "Accidents happen, honey," she'd said, holding me while I cried like a broken man. "You can't blame yourself for something that was nobody's fault." But Marshall could blame me, and he did. "You were texting," he'd said at the funeral, his voice cold as January wind. "While my son was in that car, you were texting about some stranger's problems instead of watching the road." He'd been right, of course. Sarah and I both knew it, even if she never said so. The guilt ate at her like cancer, and when her heart gave out 2 years later, I knew I'd killed them both with my carelessness. Now this little raccoon was looking at me with that one good eye, blue as a summer sky, trusting me with his life the way Tommy had trusted me with his. The parallels were almost too much to bear. "I won't let you down," I whispered, splinting the tiny leg with a popsicle stick and medical tape. "Not this time." The kit made a sound then, not quite a purr, not quite a whimper, something that reminded me so much of Tommy's sleepy murmurs that my hands started shaking again. Outside, the mother raccoon had moved closer to the window, her dark eyes never leaving her baby. As I worked, I found myself talking to the little one, the way I used to talk to Tommy during his rare quiet moments. "Your mama's quite something, you know. Takes real courage to trust a stranger with what matters most. Smart lady, that one. Reminds me of my Sarah. She always could see the good in folks even when they couldn't see it themselves." The raccoon's breathing evened out as the pain medication I'd given him took effect. His tiny paw curled around my finger with surprising strength, and for just a moment I could almost pretend it was Tommy's hand holding on to mine. But pretending wouldn't save this little life any more than it had brought back the ones I'd lost. This was real, here and now, and maybe, just maybe, it was my chance to prove that these old hands could still do more good than harm. The storm was still coming. The radio kept reminding me of that every 15 minutes, like I could forget. But right now, with this tiny heartbeat steady against my palm and a mother's love watching through my window, The world felt a little less broken than it had an hour ago. By 8:30, the little raccoon, I'd started thinking of him as Scout, though Lord knows why, was showing signs of improvement. His breathing had evened out, and that bright blue eye tracked my movements with an alertness that reminded me why raccoons had such a reputation for intelligence. I called Jake Morrison, my old Army buddy who'd set up a veterinary practice down in Chattanooga. We'd served together in Desert Storm, patching up everything from guard dogs to the occasional wild animal that wandered into our compounds. If anyone could help without asking too many awkward questions, it was Jake. "Ben, Jesus, I haven't heard from you since Sarah's funeral. What's the occasion?" I hesitated, watching Scout try to lift his head from the towel. "Got a situation here, Jake. Found an injured animal on my property. Small mammal, broken leg, some internal trauma. Could use some professional advice." "What kind of animal we talking about?" The lie came easier than it should have. "A kitten. Feral. Probably dumped by someone passing through. You know how it is up here in the mountains." Jake's sigh carried all the weight of 20 years treating abandoned pets. "Bring it down to the clinic. I can work you in around noon." "Can't do that, Jake. Storm's coming, and this little fella's too fragile to travel. Could you maybe walk me through some basics over the phone?" Through the kitchen window, I watched the mother raccoon. Ruby, I'd decided to call her after that heart-shaped marking on her forehead, arrange herself in a patch of morning sunlight. She'd found a spot where she could see both Scout and the road leading to my property. Smart girl. Jake spent the next hour guiding me through a more thorough examination. Scout's ribs were bruised but not broken, which was a miracle considering the trauma he'd obviously endured. The leg would heal clean if I kept it immobilized, and the eye swelling was already going down thanks to the cold compress I'd applied. "You always were good with the wounded ones," Jake said as we wrapped up the call. "Remember that fox kit we found outside Basra? Thing was half dead, but you nursed it back to health with nothing but field supplies and pure stubbornness." I remembered. I also remembered having to leave that fox behind when we shipped out, wondering for years if it had survived without us. Some things you just have to let go, even when every instinct tells you to hold on tighter. Around 10, while Scout dozed in a makeshift nest of towels, I heard voices from my front yard. Ruby's warning chatter had me at the window before Mrs. Henderson from next door finished climbing my porch steps. Eleanor Henderson was 73 years old, built like a scarecrow, and had the disposition of a rattlesnake with hemorrhoids. She'd made it her personal mission to keep our little corner of Tennessee civilized ever since her husband died, and left her with nothing but time and opinions. "Benjamin Walker," she announced through my screen door. "I saw that animal on your porch this morning, and I want to know what you're planning to do about it." I stepped outside, pulling the door shut behind me. Ruby had retreated to the tree line, but I could see her black eyes watching from the shadows. "Morning, Eleanor. What animal would that be? Don't play dumb with me. That raccoon and her baby. They're probably rabid, coming right up to a human dwelling like that. It's dangerous and irresponsible to encourage them." The word rabid hit me like a slap. I'd been so focused on helping Scout that I hadn't considered the legal implications. Wildlife services took rabies seriously, especially during spring when animals were most active. If Eleanor called the authorities, they'd shoot first and test for rabies later. "I haven't encouraged anything," I said carefully. "Wild animals come and go as they please. Can't control Mother Nature." Eleanor's narrow eyes narrowed further. "Well, you better find a way to control it, or I'll call the county. They'll know how to handle it properly." She stalked off toward her own property, but the damage was done. The clock was ticking now in ways I hadn't anticipated. Storm deadline was bad enough, but if Eleanor made good on her threat, Ruby and Scout wouldn't have 72 hours. They'd be lucky to have 72 minutes. I was still standing on the porch, weighing options, when the radio inside crackled to life again. Wildlife Services has announced an accelerated sweep of rural counties due to increased rabies concerns. Residents are advised that the 48-hour collection period begins Wednesday morning. 48 hours. The timeline had just shortened by a full day. Inside, Scout was awake and trying to explore his towel nest with typical raccoon curiosity. He'd managed to get the cap off my pill bottle, arthritis medication I'd left within reach, and was examining it with those tiny paws like he was solving a puzzle. The intelligence in those blue eyes was startling. "Easy there, buddy," I said, taking the bottle before he could get into real trouble. "That stuff's not for you." As if he understood, Scout set the cap down carefully and looked up at me with what could only be described as an apologetic expression. Then he did something that nearly stopped my heart. He reached out with one tiny paw and patted my hand, "Gentle as you please." Ruby appeared at the window just then, watching this interaction with obvious approval. When Scout turned toward her and made a soft, trilling sound, she responded with a series of clicks and chirps that sounded almost like conversation. They were talking, actually communicating in ways that went beyond simple animal instinct. Ruby was teaching him right there through the glass, and Scout was learning. I thought about Tommy again, the way he used to watch everything with those same bright, curious eyes. "Why do raccoons wash their food, Grandpa Ben?" he'd asked during that last visit. "Well," I'd explained, "they don't actually wash it. Their paws are so sensitive that water helps them feel what they're eating. It's like they're reading with their hands." Now, watching Scout manipulate objects with those same dexterous paws, I understood what Tommy had sensed all those years ago. These weren't just clever animals. They were small people in fur coats, with families and feelings and intelligence that deserved better than a bullet from some trigger-happy wildlife officer. The black SUV that crawled past my driveway around noon confirmed my worst fears. Tinted windows, government plates, moving just slow enough to catalog every detail of my property. They were already scouting, already planning their sweep. Ruby saw it too. Her entire body went rigid and she let out a low growl that raised the hair on my arms. She knew danger when she saw it, and she was afraid. Scout, bless his tiny heart, seemed to sense his mother's distress. He struggled to his feet, favoring that splinted leg, and made his way to the window. When he pressed his little paw against the glass, Ruby did the same from the other side, and for a moment they stayed like that, connected by nothing but love and a thin barrier of window glass. That's when I made my decision. These two had already lost enough. They weren't going to lose each other on my watch, storm or no storm, law or no law. The road to hell might be paved with good intentions, but sometimes doing right means walking that road anyway. Jake Morrison arrived at my door just after noon, carrying his old Army medic bag and wearing the kind of smile that used to get us both in trouble during our service days. He looked good for 65. Still had that lean build and sharp eyes that missed nothing, though his hair had gone completely silver since I'd seen him last. "Damn, Ben, you look like hell," he said by way of greeting. "This mountain hermit thing isn't doing you any favors." "Charming as ever, Jake. Come on in." He stepped inside and immediately spotted Scout on the kitchen table, now alert and watching our exchange with those unnaturally bright blue eyes. Jake froze mid-step, and I watched his expression shift from casual interest to something much more focused. "Ben," he said slowly, "that's not a kitten." "No," I admitted. "It's not." Jake moved closer, pulling out a small flashlight to examine Scout's features. The little guy didn't flinch, just studied Jake with the same intensity he was receiving. When Jake reached out to check the splint on Scout's leg, Scout actually leaned into the touch, as if he understood this human was trying to help. Jesus Christ, Ben. Do you have any idea what you've got here? The tone in Jake's voice set off every alarm bell I'd developed in 40 years of reading people. Enlighten me. Jake straightened up, and when he looked at me, there was something calculating in his eyes that I'd never seen before. This is a blue-eyed raccoon kit, genetic anomaly that occurs in maybe 1 in 10,000 births. I've got collectors who'd pay $50,000 for an animal like this, no questions asked. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Collectors? Private exotic animal trade, completely legal if you know the right paperwork to file. Rich folks love rare pets, especially ones this intelligent and unusual. Jake was already pulling out his phone. I've got a contact in Memphis who specializes in this kind of acquisition. We could have this little guy in a luxury habitat by tomorrow night, split the profits 60-40. I stared at him. This man I'd trusted with my life in 3 different combat zones, and realized I was looking at a stranger. You're talking about stealing someone's baby, Jake. Don't be sentimental. It's a wild animal, not someone's kid. And look at him. He's already half domesticated. Probably be happier in captivity anyway, getting regular meals and veterinary care. Scout chose that moment to make one of his soft, trilling sounds, the same noise he'd been using to communicate with Ruby through the window. Jake's eyes lit up like he'd just discovered oil in his backyard. Did you hear that? That's not normal raccoon vocalization. This little guy's been selectively communicating. The intelligence quotient alone would drive the price even higher. Outside, I could see Ruby pacing along the tree line, agitated by the presence of a stranger near her baby. She'd venture closer to the house, then retreat, clearly torn between protective instincts and fear of humans. Every few minutes, she'd make a low warning sound that Scout would answer with reassuring chirps. "Jake," I said carefully, "I called you for medical advice, not a business proposition." "Come on, Ben. You're living on Army pension and Social Security in a house that's falling apart around your ears. When's the last time you had 50 grand in the bank? Hell, when's the last time you had 5 grand? He wasn't wrong about my finances. The roof needed work, the furnace was held together with duct tape and prayer, and my medicine cabinet was full of expired pills I couldn't afford to replace. $50,000 would solve every practical problem I had. It would also destroy the first spark of purpose I'd felt since Sarah died." "The mother's still alive," I said. "She brought him to me for help, not profit." Jake glanced toward the window where Ruby was visible in the afternoon shadows. "We can deal with the mother if she becomes a problem. These animals are surprisingly resilient. She'll move on, find another mate, have more babies. It's just nature." The casual way he dismissed Ruby's maternal bond made something cold and hard settle in my chest. This was the same man who'd spent hours helping me nurse that fox kit back to health in Iraq, who'd cried when we had to leave it behind. Whatever had happened to Jake Morrison over the past 20 years, it had killed the part of him that understood love didn't have a price tag. "I need you to leave, Jake." His expression shifted, become less friendly and more businesslike. "Ben, be smart about this. You can't keep that animal. It's illegal to harbor wildlife without permits, and with the rabies scare going on, wildlife services will shoot first and ask questions later. At least my way, the little guy lives. In a cage. In safety. With regular meals, climate control, and veterinary care. That's more than most wild animals get." Scout had been listening to this exchange with obvious interest, his head turning back and forth between us like he was following the conversation. Now he struggled to his feet, balancing carefully on his splinted leg, and moved toward me. When he reached the edge of the table, he stretched out his tiny paws in a clear request to be picked up. I gathered him gently against my chest, feeling the rapid flutter of his heartbeat and the warmth of absolute trust. He settled into the crook of my arm like he belonged there, one tiny paw coming up to rest against my shirt. "That's your answer right there," Jake said, watching this interaction. "He's already bonded to you. Take him away from his mother now, and he'll transfer that attachment to whoever feeds him." It's basic animal psychology. The front door was still open, and Ruby's distressed chittering was getting louder. She could see her baby in the arms of a stranger, and every maternal instinct was telling her to intervene. Scout heard her too. He lifted his head and made a series of reassuring sounds that seemed to calm her slightly. "A man's character is what he does when nobody's watching," I said quietly, stroking Scout's soft fur. "My Sarah used to say that. Guess we're about to find out what kind of character you've got, Jake." Jake's face hardened. "Don't get self-righteous with me, Ben. You've got 24 hours to think this through. After that, I make some phone calls, and this situation gets resolved with or without your cooperation." "Is that a threat?" "It's a fact. Wildlife Services knows I consult on unusual animal cases. One word from me about a rabies suspect raccoon family on your property, and they'll be here with tranquilizer guns before sundown." He packed up his medical bag with sharp, angry movements. At the door, he turned back one last time. $50,000, Ben. Think about what Sarah would want you to do with that kind of money. Think about the medical bills she had at the end, the ones you're still paying off." The door slammed behind him, leaving me alone with Scout and the sound of Ruby's increasingly frantic calls from the yard. Through the window, I watched Jake's pickup truck disappear down the mountain road, probably already planning his next move. Scout looked up at me with those impossibly blue eyes, and I saw something there that reminded me so much of Tommy. It took my breath away. Trust, complete, innocent faith that the adult holding him would keep him safe from all the dangers of the world. I'd failed that trust once before, with consequences that destroyed my family and broke my heart beyond repair. The weight of that failure had been crushing me for 5 years, a burden I carried every waking moment. But maybe, just maybe, this time could be different. "What do you think, little soldier?" I whispered to Scout. "You ready to fight the good fight?" He answered with a tiny chirp that sounded almost like yes, and I knew I'd found my hill to die on. The afternoon sun was slanting through my kitchen windows when Ruby led me to her secret. Scout had been restless since Jake left, making soft, distressed sounds that seemed to echo his mother's agitation outside. When I carried him to the back porch to get some air, Ruby emerged from the tree line with purposeful steps, looking directly at me before heading toward the old barn behind my property. She stopped every few yards to look back, clearly wanting me to follow. Scout perked up in my arms, chittering excitedly at his mother, and I found myself walking after a raccoon like it was the most natural thing in the world. The barn had belonged to the previous owner, a dairy farmer who'd died back in the 80s. I'd been using it for storage mostly, old furniture, boxes of Sarah's things I couldn't bring myself to sort through, rusty tools that might come in handy someday. Ruby disappeared through a gap in the siding that I'd never bothered to repair. Inside, the late afternoon light filtered through broken boards, casting everything in golden stripes. Ruby led me to the far corner, where she'd built what could only be described as a wildlife hospital. 5 animals were resting in carefully constructed nests of stolen blankets, old towels, and what looked like pieces of my missing bath towels. A young possum with a splinted tail, a red squirrel with bandaged ribs, 2 juvenile skunks, obviously orphaned, curled together for warmth, and in the center of it all, an adult fox with her front paw wrapped in what I recognized as strips from one of Sarah's old bed sheets. "Well, I'll be damned," I whispered. Ruby had been running her own rescue operation for months, maybe longer. every missing piece of fabric, every small tool that had mysteriously vanished from my workshed. Every time I'd blamed my failing memory for misplacing things, she'd been borrowing supplies for her patients. The fox lifted her head as we approached, alert but not afraid. When Ruby made a series of soft sounds, the fox actually seemed to relax. Scout was practically vibrating with excitement in my arms, making happy, chittering noises at what was clearly his extended family. I knelt down carefully, mindful of the various injuries around me. The possum's tail had been expertly splinted with twigs and medical tape. My medical tape, I realized, from the kit I'd used on Scout. The red squirrel's ribs were bound with gauge that looked suspiciously like the kind Jake had brought for the kitten. Ruby had been watching me treat Scout and learning from it. She'd somehow figured out basic first aid principles and was applying them to other injured animals she'd found. The intelligence required for that kind of observation and adaptation was staggering. "How long have you been doing this, girl?" I asked her. She tilted her head and made a soft, trilling sound, then moved to the fox and began grooming behind her ears with obvious affection. The fox closed her eyes and leaned into the attention, and I realized these weren't just patients, they were family. Ruby had created a chosen family of broken creatures, all healing together in the shadows of my forgotten barn. As I watched this interaction, memories flooded back of Marshall as a boy, bringing home every stray and injured animal he could find. Sarah and I had encouraged it then, proud of his compassionate heart. Our kitchen had been a revolving door of wounded birds, orphaned rabbits, and the occasional snake that made Sarah shriek and retreat to the living room. "Animals trust him," Sarah had said after 12-year-old Marshall successfully raised a baby owl whose mother had been killed by a car. "He's got a gift for seeing what they need." That gift had died with Tommy. In the 5 years since the accident, Marshall had chosen to see animals as threats to be controlled rather than lives to be protected. He'd traded his childhood compassion for a badge and a gun, and somewhere along the way, he'd convinced himself that was strength. Looking at Ruby's makeshift hospital, I wondered if this was what strength actually looked like. Not the power to control and contain, but the courage to heal and nurture despite the risks. Scout was getting heavy in my arm, so I settled cross-legged on the barn floor, letting him explore the space while staying close enough to grab him if needed. He immediately made his way to each of the other animals, greeting them with gentle touches and soft sounds. The red squirrel actually groomed his ears, while the young skunks accepted him into their cuddle pile without hesitation. Ruby watched this reunion with obvious satisfaction, and I realized this wasn't Scout's first visit to the barn. She'd been bringing him here regularly, teaching him about family bonds that extended beyond blood relationships. These animals had been helping raise him, each contributing their own skills and protection to his development. The sound of an engine on the main road snapped me back to reality. Through the barn's broken boards, I could see another black SUV creeping past my driveway, this one stopping long enough for someone to take photographs of my property. They were building a case file, documenting everything for tomorrow's operation. Ruby heard it too, and her entire body tensed. She moved quickly to each of her patients, making urgent, chittering sounds that sent them all deeper into their nests. The message was clear. Danger was coming, and they needed to be ready to hide. "Ruby," I said quietly, and she turned those intelligent dark eyes toward me. "They're coming for all of you tomorrow. Jake called them. I'm sure of it. They'll have tranquilizer guns and cages, and they won't care about your hospital or your family. To them, you're just wild animals that need to be contained." She understood. I could see it in her expression, the way her ears flattened against her head and her tail began to twitch with agitation. She'd survived long enough to build this sanctuary because she knew how to read danger, And right now, everything in her body language screamed that the threat was real and immediate. Scout seemed to sense the mood shift. He moved away from the other animals and came back to me, climbing carefully up my leg to nestle against my chest. His tiny heartbeat was rapid with anxiety, and I found myself stroking his fur in a rhythm that seemed to calm us both. "I won't let them take you," I promised, though I had no idea how to keep that promise. "Any of you. There's got to be a way to—" The sound of gravel crunching under tires cut me off. Someone was coming up my driveway, and it was too early for the official raid. I scooped up Scout and moved to the barn's side window, peering through a gap in the boards. Eleanor Henderson's ancient Buick was parked behind my house, and she was walking around my property with two men I didn't recognize. One was carrying a clipboard and taking notes, while the other had some kind of camera with a long lens. They were documenting everything: the food scraps Ruby had left near my back porch, the small paths her family had worn through my yard, the evidence of wild animals treating my property like a safe haven. "Building her case," I muttered. Eleanor had made good on her threat, and now she was providing wildlife services with all the ammunition they needed to justify aggressive action. Ruby had gone completely still beside me, every instinct telling her to freeze until the threat passed. But Scout was too young to understand the danger. He saw people outside and made a happy chittering sound, the same greeting he'd been using with me all day. The man with the camera immediately turned toward the barn. Ruby moved faster than I'd ever seen an animal move. She snatched Scout from my arms with gentle teeth, just like she'd carried him to my porch that morning, and disappeared through her escape route in the barn's back wall. The other animals followed within seconds, melting into the shadows like they'd never been there at all. I was alone in the barn when Eleanor and her investigators arrived, surrounded by empty nests and the lingering warmth of trust that had just been shattered by human betrayal. "Nobody's supposed to be in here," Eleanor announced through the gap in the siding. "This is private property." "My private property," I replied, stepping into the light. "And last I checked, Eleanor, I didn't give you permission to bring strangers onto it." The investigators exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation. One of them, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, cleared his throat. "Mr. Walker? I'm Dennis Cole from Wildlife Services. We've received reports of unusual animal activity on your property, and we're conducting a preliminary assessment." "Unusual how?" "Raccoons approaching human dwellings without fear, evidence of feeding and sheltering wild animals, possible rabies exposure." Cole consulted his clipboard. "Mrs. Henderson has provided us with several photographs documenting concerning behavior patterns." Eleanor smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd just won a long-fought battle. "I told you, Benjamin. These animals need to be dealt with properly by professionals who understand the risks." Standing in Ruby's abandoned hospital, surrounded by the evidence of her compassion and intelligence, I felt something inside me that had been dormant for 5 years finally wake up. It was the same feeling I'd had in the Army when faced with impossible situations, a calm, cold determination that said some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the odds. "Gentlemen," I said, stepping out of the barn to face them directly, "I think it's time you moved along. Unless you've got a warrant, you're trespassing." Cole and his partner looked uncomfortable, but Eleanor's eyes blazed with righteous anger. "You can't protect them forever, Benjamin. Tomorrow morning, this problem gets solved once and for all." As they walked back to their vehicles, I caught a glimpse of Ruby watching from the deep woods, Scout safely hidden somewhere behind her. She'd trusted me with her secret, and I'd let strangers destroy her sanctuary. But the war wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. They came at dawn like an invading army, 5 black SUVs rolling up my driveway in formation while I stood on my porch with a cup of coffee that had gone cold in my hands. The Tennessee mountains were still wrapped in morning mist, and the first rays of sunlight caught the Wildlife Service's logos on the vehicles, like badges of authority I was supposed to respect. I didn't respect them. Not one damn bit. The lead vehicle disgorged 4 officers in tactical gear, followed by 2 more teams from the other SUVs, 12 people total, all armed with tranquilizer guns and wearing hazmat suits like they were expecting to encounter the plague. For a Raccoon family, the absurdity of it would have been funny if the stakes weren't so high. Ruby had brought Scout back to my basement around 3 in the morning, along with all her other patients. She'd somehow understood that scattering to the woods wouldn't be enough. They needed a place the humans couldn't easily search, somewhere they could stay hidden until the danger passed. My basement had become their bunker, and I was their last line of defense. The officer in charge removed his helmet as he approached my porch, revealing a face I'd been dreading to see. Marshal Thompson had aged well in the 20 years since I'd last laid eyes on him. Still had that strong jaw and steady gaze that reminded me so much of his mother. But there was something hard in his expression now, something that spoke of deliberate distance and carefully maintained emotional walls. "Benjamin Walker?" His voice was professional, neutral, giving no hint that he'd once called me Dad. "That's right." I kept my own voice level, though my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "I'm Deputy Marshal Thompson with Wildlife Services. We have reports of dangerous animal activity on this property, and we're here to conduct a health and safety inspection." The formal tone cut deep, but I'd expected it. Marshall had always been good at compartmentalizing, even as a child. When he was hurt or angry, he'd retreat behind a wall of politeness that was harder to breach than any fortress. "Dangerous how?" I asked. Though I knew Ruby and her family were probably listening from the basement, understanding every word even if they couldn't comprehend the full implications. "Raccoons displaying abnormal behavior, approaching human dwellings, possible rabies exposure." Marshall consulted a tablet computer with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 100 times before. "We need to search the property and remove any wild animals for testing and relocation." The word testing made my blood run cold. They weren't planning to relocate anything. Rabies testing required brain tissue samples, which meant every animal they caught would be dead within hours of leaving my property. "You got a warrant for this search, Marshal?" His head snapped up at the use of his first name, and for just a moment I saw the boy he'd been flickering behind those professional eyes. But the moment passed quickly, and his expression hardened into something that looked almost like contempt. "I don't need a warrant for a public health emergency, Mr. Walker, and I'd prefer if you addressed me as Deputy Thompson." "Fair enough, Deputy Thompson, but this is still my property, and I'm telling you there are no dangerous animals here. Haven't seen hide nor hair of any raccoons for weeks." It was a bold-faced lie, and we both knew it. From where I stood, I could hear faint sounds from the basement, soft, scraping noises that might have been Ruby moving her patients to safer hiding spots. The house had been built in the 1940s with thick foundation walls and a root cellar that extended under the back porch. If they were lucky, the sounds wouldn't carry to the officers positioned around my yard. Marshal, Deputy Thompson, gestured to his team, and they began spreading out across my property with military precision. I watched one group head toward the barn while another started examining the areas around my house where Ruby had been bringing food offerings. They were thorough, professional, and utterly without mercy for the small lives they were hunting. "You know," I said conversationally, "there was a time when you cared about protecting animals, not hunting them down like criminals." The barb hit home. Marshall's jaw tightened and he took a step closer to the porch. "There was a time when I trusted your judgment about what was safe and what wasn't. We both know how that worked out." The accusation hung in the air between us like a loaded weapon. 5 years of anger and grief and guilt, all crystallized into that one bitter sentence. He was right, of course. I had failed his trust, failed his son, failed everyone who'd ever counted on me to keep them safe. But standing there with Ruby's family hiding beneath my feet, I realized something that had taken me 5 years to understand. Failure didn't have to be permanent. Sometimes it was just the price you paid for learning how to do better. "You're right," I said quietly. "I failed Tommy, and I failed you, and I failed your mother. But that doesn't mean I'm going to fail again. This isn't about failure, old man. This is about public safety and following the law." "The law?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Son, I've seen what happens when good people hide behind the law to avoid doing what's right. I spent 30 years in the Army, remember? I know the difference between following orders and following your conscience." One of the search teams was getting close to the basement entrance on the side of the house. From inside, I heard a faint thump that might have been Scout bumping into something in the darkness. Marshall heard it too. His head turned toward the sound, and his hand moved instinctively toward the tranquilizer gun at his hip. "There's nothing down there but old furniture and Christmas decorations," I said quickly. "House settles sometimes, especially when the weather changes." But Marshall was already moving toward the basement door, his team following behind him like a pack of wolves who'd caught a scent. I stepped off the porch to intercept him, my arthritic knees protesting the sudden movement. "Deputy Thompson, I'm asking you politely to respect my property and my privacy. If you want to search my basement, get a warrant." He stopped and turned to face me, and for the first time since he'd arrived, his professional mask slipped completely. The man looking back at me wasn't a wildlife officer doing his job. He was a son confronting the father who'd destroyed his family. "You're protecting them," he said, and his voice carried 20 years of accumulated pain. "Just like you protected that damn cell phone when you should have been watching the road." The accusation hit me like a physical blow, driving the air from my lungs and leaving me speechless. Around us, his team had gone silent, suddenly aware they were witnessing something far more personal than a routine wildlife inspection. "Marshall," I whispered, but he cut me off with a sharp gesture. "It's Deputy Thompson, and you're going to step aside and let me do my job, or I'm going to arrest you for obstruction of justice." The basement door was maybe 20 feet away. If Ruby had any sense, she'd already moved her family to the deepest part of the root cellar, where they might have a chance of staying hidden. But Scout was just a baby, and babies made noise when they were scared. All it would take was one sound at the wrong moment, and this whole confrontation would be over. "Please," I said, dropping my voice so only Marshall could hear. "Whatever you think of me, whatever I did to our family, don't let that poison what you are. You used to care about protecting the innocent." For just a moment his expression wavered. I saw the boy who'd spent hours nursing a baby owl back to health, the teenager who'd cried when we had to put down our old dog Rex, the young man who'd chosen a career in environmental protection because he believed in making the world better for all living creatures. Then the moment passed, and Deputy Thompson was back, cold and professional and utterly without mercy. "Officer Martinez," he called to one of his team members. "Well, bring the bolt cutters. We're going in." That's when I heard it, a sound that froze the blood in my veins and brought every head in the yard snapping toward the basement door. Scout's distinctive chittering call, muffled by stone and wood, but unmistakably the cry of a young raccoon in distress. Marshall's eyes met mine across the 20 feet of yard that separated us, and I saw grim satisfaction in his expression. "Game over, old man. Step aside." The truth was about to come out, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do to stop it. The basement door creaked open like the gates of hell, and Marshall stepped into the darkness with his tranquilizer gun raised and ready. I followed behind him, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst, watching 20 years of estrangement and 5 years of guilt converge into this one terrible moment. The basement smelled like old wood and damp earth, with an undertone of wild animal musk that no amount of denial could explain away. Marshall's flashlight beam swept across stacked boxes and covered furniture, searching for movement in the shadows. His team spread out behind us, their own lights creating a web of illumination that left fewer and fewer places to hide. "I know you're down here," Marshall called into the darkness, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Come out slowly, and nobody gets hurt." For a moment there was nothing but silence. Then Ruby emerged from behind an old armoire, moving with the careful dignity of a queen accepting defeat. Scout was tucked safely in her mouth, his blue eyes wide with terror, but his tiny body completely still. She knew that any sudden movement would trigger the tranquilizer guns, and she was willing to sacrifice herself to keep her baby calm. Behind her came the others, the fox with her bandaged paw, the young possum with his splinted tail, the orphaned skunks huddled together for comfort. 7 wild animals who'd trusted me to keep them safe, now facing capture because I'd failed them, just like I'd failed everyone else who'd ever counted on me. "Jesus Christ," whispered Officer Martinez, lowering his weapon slightly. "It's like a goddamn Noah's Ark down here." Marshall's flashlight beam fixed on Ruby, and I watched his expression change as he took in the careful way she held Scout, the protective stance of a mother shielding her child from danger. For just a moment his professional mask slipped, and I saw recognition flicker in his eyes, the same maternal devotion he'd witnessed in countless other species during his years in wildlife management. "Put the kit down and back away," he ordered, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Ruby understood the command, but she didn't obey. Instead, she looked directly at Marshall with those intelligent dark eyes and made a sound I'd never heard before, a low, mournful cry that sounded disturbingly like a human woman pleading for her child's life. Scout answered with his own cry, a tiny, chittering wail that cut through the basement air like a knife through my heart. The sound was so much like Tommy's cry the night he'd had pneumonia, that same desperate, innocent plea for someone to make the hurt stop, that I actually staggered against the wall. "Deputy Thompson," I said, my voice hoarse with emotion, "look at them. Really look. That's not rabies or aggression. That's a mother trying to protect her baby, just like any mother would." Marshall's jaw tightened, but he didn't lower his weapon. "Wild animals carrying diseases, living in unsanitary conditions, posing a threat to public health. That's all I see." But I could tell he was seeing more than that. The way his hand trembled slightly on the tranquilizer gun, the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, the careful distance he was maintaining from Ruby and Scout, all of it spoke to an internal battle between duty and conscience. "She brought him to me," I continued, desperate to reach whatever compassion might still exist inside the man my son had become. "Carried him to my porch when he was dying, trusted me to save his life. What kind of mother does that take? What kind of intelligence? What kind of love?" "Anthropomorphism," Marshall said, but the word sounded hollow even to him. "You're projecting human emotions onto animals that don't." Scout chose that moment to do something that stopped him mid-sentence. The little raccoon struggled free from his mother's protective grip and moved toward Marshall on unsteady legs, favoring the splinted limb but determined to reach the human who represented such obvious danger to his family. "Scout, no," I breathed, but the kit ignored me. He approached Marshall with the same fearless trust he'd shown me that first morning, reaching up with tiny paws as if asking to be picked up. Marshall stared down at those blue eyes, Tommy's eyes, and for a moment the basement was completely silent except for the sound of grown men struggling to breathe normally. "He's not afraid of you," whispered Officer Martinez. "Jesus, look at him. He thinks you're here to help." Scout made a soft, trilling sound, the same greeting he'd been using with me for days. Then he did something that shattered every defense Marshall had built around his heart. He gently touched Marshall's boot with one tiny paw and looked up at him with complete, innocent trust. The tranquilizer gun clattered to the floor. "Dad?" Marshall's voice cracked like he was 12 years old again, and suddenly he wasn't Deputy Thompson anymore. He was just my son, staring down at a creature who reminded him of everything he'd lost and everything he'd tried so hard to forget. "I see him too," I said quietly. "Every time I look at those eyes, I see Tommy. I know it's crazy. I know it doesn't make sense, but it's not crazy." Marshall knelt down slowly, and Scout immediately climbed up his leg to perch on his knee. The little raccoon studied his face with obvious curiosity, then reached out to gently touch Marshall's cheek with one paw. "God help me, I see him too." Ruby had been watching this interaction with obvious tension, ready to defend her baby if necessary. But as Scout settled comfortably in Marshall's arms, making happy chittering sounds, she seemed to understand that the immediate danger had passed. She moved closer, her dark eyes fixed on Marshall's face, with an intensity that was almost human. 20 years, Marshall said, stroking Scout's soft fur with shaking hands. 20 years I've been telling myself that animals are just animals, that they don't think or feel or love the way we do. It was easier that way. Easier to control them, relocate them, put them down when necessary. Easier to stay angry at me, I added. He looked up, and I saw tears in his eyes for the first time since Tommy's funeral. "I blamed you for texting while driving, but the truth is I blamed the deer too. Blamed every wild animal that had ever crossed a road or gotten in the way of human progress." It was easier than accepting that sometimes terrible things just happen. Scout had fallen asleep in Marshall's arms, exhausted by the stress of the morning. Ruby moved even closer, until she was sitting right beside Marshall's knee, watching her baby with obvious relief. The other animals had emerged from their hiding places, sensing that the immediate threat had passed. "These animals," Marshall said, looking around at Ruby's makeshift family, "they're not just surviving, they're taking care of each other. That fox with the bandaged paw, those orphaned skunks, she's been protecting them all." "For months," I confirmed. "Building her own little rescue operation in my barn, teaching Scout about family and loyalty and love. Things I thought I'd forgotten how to do." Marshall was quiet for a long moment, holding Scout while Ruby groomed her baby's fur with obvious affection. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I became everything I used to hate, didn't I?" "The kind of person who sees problems instead of possibilities, who destroys instead of protects." "You became someone trying to control a world that had hurt him too much," I said. "But that's not who you really are, son. This is who you really are." Scout opened one sleepy blue eye and made a contented sound that was half purr, half sigh. Ruby responded with a gentle trill, and suddenly the basement was filled with soft animal sounds, communications of comfort and safety and family bonds that transcended species. "Officer Martinez," Marshall called to his second-in-command, his voice stronger now. "Radio headquarters, tell them the search was negative, no evidence of diseased animals on this property." "Sir, but we found an old man caring for some injured wildlife, which is perfectly legal with the proper permits. Permits that Mr. Walker will be filing first thing Monday morning." Marshall looked at me with something that might have been the beginning of forgiveness. "Won't you, Dad?" The word hit me like a physical blow. 20 years of silence and anger finally broken by a sleeping raccoon kit and a mother's unconditional love. "Yes, son, I will." Ruby looked up at both of us then, and I swear on Sarah's grave that Raccoon smiled. The storm that had been threatening for 3 days finally broke that evening, but instead of driving us apart, it brought us together in ways I'd never imagined possible. Marshall sent his team back to headquarters with their false report, while the three of us, father, son, and surrogate grandson, rode out the tempest in my basement with Ruby's extended family. Scout had claimed Marshall's lap as his personal territory, purring like a tiny engine, while my son told stories about his work with wildlife conservation before bureaucracy, and grief had hardened his heart. Ruby listened from her perch on an old storage trunk, her intelligent eyes tracking every word as if she understood the healing that was taking place in the darkness below ground. "You know what the crazy thing is?" Marshall said, stroking Scout's fur while thunder rolled overhead. "I've spent the last 20 years convincing myself that animals don't really love, that maternal instinct is just biological programming. But watching Ruby with Scout, seeing how she organized this whole rescue operation, that's not programming. That's choice. That's compassion." "Your mother always said animals have souls," I replied, settling the young possum more comfortably in my arms. "Said you could see it in their eyes if you knew how to look. I stopped looking after Tommy died. Stopped seeing anything but threats and problems and obstacles to human progress." Marshall's voice was quiet, almost lost in the sound of rain drumming against the basement windows. Easier to tranquilize and relocate than to admit that every animal has a story, has a family, has feelings that matter. Scout chose that moment to wake up and begin exploring Marshall's uniform with typical raccoon curiosity. He managed to work open a button pocket and extract Marshall's badge, examining it with those impossibly blue eyes before offering it back with a polite, chittering sound. "He's returning it," Marshall laughed, the first real laughter I'd heard from him in 20 years, like he understands it's important, but doesn't want to keep something that isn't his. Ruby made an approving sound, clearly proud of her son's good manners. The fox with the bandaged paw had moved closer to the warmth of our little group, while the orphaned skunks had fallen asleep in a pile against my side. We were an unlikely family, but we were a family nonetheless. As the storm raged outside, Marshall told me about his wife Linda and their 2 children, my grandchildren I'd never met. 8-year-old Emma, who loved horses, and 10-year-old Jake, who collected rocks and dreamed of becoming a geologist. He pulled out his phone and showed me pictures, and I saw Tommy's features reflected in both young faces. "They don't know about you," he admitted. "I told them their grandfather died in the war." The words stung, but I understood them. "Sometimes it's easier to mourn the dead than to forgive the living. Would you like them to know?" I asked carefully. Marshall was quiet for a long moment, watching Scout play with the zipper on his jacket. "I think I'd like them to meet Scout first, see if they understand what I'm just starting to figure out, that family comes in all shapes and sizes, and love doesn't always follow the rules we expect." By morning the storm had passed, leaving the mountain air clean and bright with possibility. Marshall helped me move Ruby's patients back to the barn, which we converted into a proper wildlife rehabilitation facility, using supplies from his department and knowledge from both our pasts. The red squirrel was healthy enough to release within a week. The fox's paw healed cleanly, and she returned to the wild with obvious reluctance, looking back several times as if thanking us for our care. The young possum found a foster family among the local wildlife, but still visited Ruby occasionally, bringing news from the larger forest community. Scout grew stronger every day, his intelligence and personality blossoming under the care of both his birth mother and his chosen grandfather. He learned to open doors, solve simple puzzles, and communicate with a vocabulary of sounds that seemed to expand daily. But more importantly, he learned about trust and love, and the bonds that hold families together. Ruby surprised us all by accepting Marshall as part of her extended family. She would greet him each morning with soft, chittering sounds, and often brought him small gifts, smooth stones, interesting leaves, once a vintage pocket watch she'd somehow liberated from Eleanor Henderson's yard. Her way of saying thank you, I supposed, though it felt more like adoption. Eleanor herself proved to be our biggest challenge and our greatest triumph. When she discovered that her anonymous tip had resulted in an official wildlife sanctuary being established in her neighborhood, she was furious. But her anger transformed into reluctant respect when Scout began visiting her garden, carefully avoiding her vegetables while entertaining her with his acrobatic abilities. "That raccoon has better manners than most humans," she admitted grudgingly after Scout returned a dropped glove to her porch. "And he's cleaner than my nephew's children." 6 months later, Marshall brought his family for their first visit. Emma fell in love with Scout immediately, while Jake was fascinated by Ruby's problem-solving abilities. They spent the weekend learning about wildlife rehabilitation and hearing stories about their grandfather's army days and their father's childhood love of animals. "Why did you stop talking to Grandpa Ben?" Emma asked, with the devastating directness of childhood. Marshall looked at me across the kitchen table where Scout was demonstrating his ability to sort different colored blocks. "Because I forgot that loving someone means forgiving them when they make mistakes, even big ones." "But you remember now?" Jake asked hopefully. "Yeah, buddy, I remember now." The real miracle happened a year later during Scout's first mating season. Instead of disappearing into the wild to find a mate, he brought a young female raccoon to meet his family. Ruby accepted her immediately, and soon we had a new generation of kits tumbling around the barn under the watchful eyes of their grandmother and human grandfather. One evening, as I sat on my porch watching Scout teach his babies how to wash their food in the stream behind my house, Marshall joined me with 2 cups of coffee and a thoughtfulness that had become familiar over the months of our reconciliation. "You know what Sarah would say about all this?" he said, settling into the chair beside mine. "That love makes a family, not blood," I replied, remembering her words from years past. "And that sometimes the smallest creatures teach us the biggest lessons about what it means to be human," Marshall added. Scout looked up from his parenting duties and chittered a greeting that sounded remarkably like, "Hello, family." Ruby emerged from the barn with a dignified nod that somehow conveyed both approval and deep satisfaction. The babies continued their swimming lessons, oblivious to the human emotions swirling around them but secure in the knowledge that they were surrounded by love. As the sun set behind the Tennessee mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, I realized that Sarah had been right about everything. Love does make a family. Forgiveness does heal wounds that seem too deep to mend. And sometimes the most broken hearts are the ones capable of the greatest love. The empty chair beside me wasn't empty anymore. The silence that had filled my house for 5 years had been replaced by laughter and chittering conversations and the sound of small feet, both human and otherwise, running through rooms that had forgotten what joy sounded like. Scout's babies would grow up knowing that family means showing up when someone needs you, that love transcends species and circumstance, and that sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply choosing to trust again. Ruby had taught us all that lesson, one tiny heartbeat at a time. And in the end, perhaps that's all any of us can hope to do, to notice when someone needs help, to find the courage to act rather than look away, and to remember that home isn't a place, but whoever welcomes you with open arms. Even if those arms happen to have tiny paws and an unlimited capacity for forgiveness. Friends, if you've made it this far in Ben and Scout's journey, you know that sometimes our greatest heartbreaks become the doorway to our most unexpected blessings. Like Ben, many of us carry the weight of past mistakes, moments when we looked away at the wrong time, said the harsh word we can't take back, or let pride build walls where love should have built bridges. But Ruby's story reminds us that healing doesn't require perfection. It requires showing up with open hearts when someone needs us most. At 68, Ben thought his chance for family was over, that his failures had written the final chapter of his story. Then a tiny raccoon with Tommy's blue eyes taught him that love makes family, not blood, and that forgiveness, like Scout's gentle paw reaching toward Marshall's face, can bridge any distance when we have the courage to trust again. Whether it's reconnecting with estranged children, opening our hearts to unexpected friendships, or simply choosing compassion over bitterness, we all have the power to write new chapters filled with purpose and joy. The question isn't whether we deserve a second chance, it's whether we're brave enough to take it. What past hurt are you ready to heal in your own life? Have you ever experienced an unexpected connection that changed everything? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear how hope found its way back into your heart.